Many companies don't have procedures for offboarding directors. So how can boards approach a conversation that's often overdue and uncomfortable? Welcome to BoardVision, the official podcast of the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors. We share perspectives from leading corporate directors and explore what makes boards effective, including how they can help companies prepare for the future. In this episode, Evelyn Dilsaver, a director on the board of Bailard Health Equity and Somnigroup International, speaks with NACD advisor Susan Paley. Together, they unpack director offboarding. They discuss what may cause a director to step down, how boards can handle departures with care, and why succession planning is crucial.
Have you heard about the benefits of NACD's certification program? Today's boards operate in a dynamic and rapidly evolving world. The National Association of Corporate Directors provides directorship certification that sets the standard for high-impact board directors. It's more than certification. This is the premier program, preparing directors to successfully navigate an increasingly complex business and governance landscape. NACD's directorship certification will enable you to demonstrate commitment, deliver confidently, and create real value for your organization. Learn more and apply today at nacdonline.org. And now, your host.
Evelyn, what are the reasons that a director might need to be offboarded or step down from a board?
There's a couple of reasons, Susan. One is an automatic reason, which is you've changed roles in your company, or you've added a new board and you don't have capacity or time to devote to the board that you're sitting on. The SEC also dictates that if you're chairing an audit committee, you can only chair or be on the audit committee for 3 public companies at any one point in time. So, for example, I joined a 4th public company board and I could not serve on the audit committee, even though that's why they wanted me, because of the SEC rules. So there are a couple of reasons. And then part of it is voluntary, right? You don't have time, you don't have the capacity, or with the SEC rules. But the other one is when you're asked to step off the board because the other directors don't feel you're contributing to the board at the level that you should be contributing, or your skill sets are just not there anymore.
For the board that you're on now, maybe it was 3 years ago when you were brought on. We also, in another conversation, talked about term limits and age limits. That's a natural cadence of rolling off, yes?
Yes. Term limits, age limits are a natural cadence for rolling off. And again, not many companies use it. In fact, a lot of companies don't have either age limits or term limits. So they don't really have a good mechanism for offboarding an individual board director. And that's when it becomes really contentious. At least with age limits and term limits, you know you're coming to a point where you can have a conversation with that director to say, coming up with age limit, or, you're coming up with the term limit. How are you feeling about your contribution? And here's how we feel about your contribution. And it's time to step off. And if you have a good chair of the board or a good chair of nominating gov, they will make sure that conversation has taken place. So I just joined a brand new board that just went public about a year ago, chair nominating gov. And I asked them, do you want term limits? Do you want age limits? And they said no. So I said, okay, so then the way we're going to do this is we're going to do individual board director evaluations. And as CEO and chair of the board, or as chair of nominating gov, I'll have the conversation with you once a year to say, how are you doing? And is it time to leave? But it takes courage, Susan.
No kidding. So how does that go? That can be a sticky conversation. How do you have that discussion? And who must, by the way, you were the NomGov chair. Is that usually the role, or is the chair? How does that work?
Well, usually the way it works, it should be the chair of the board. But sometimes your chair of the board may not have the courage to actually have that conversation. So as chair of Nom and Gov, I think it falls to that individual or the CEO, depending on the relationship, right? In this new company that I just joined as chair of Nominating Gov, I set the stage at the very beginning. We're going to do director evaluations. I will give you the feedback along with the outside party that's giving you the coaching and feedback. And I share that with the CEO. So the CEO and I have a conversation about how is this individual performing, and is there something that we should be doing to coach them so that they can contribute at a better level. But there are times when you have to offboard somebody because of their behavior. And that's also happened. We had one director who never said a word during the meeting, and we did board evaluations. So it kept coming back that this individual never contributed anything at the meeting. And when confronted, he said, well, somebody else already beat me to what I was going to say. So maybe I should just say it faster. And they said, well, no, that's not the point, right? And we had to have the individual voluntarily resign, is how we put it.
In the examples that you provided just now, I heard that you leaned on data. You either had an eval done by a third party or input and feedback. I get curious about how you can have that sticky discussion. So is data really required? And what happens to the, I don't know, maybe less well-resourced boards who haven't invested that year in a third-party evaluation? How do they go about this?
So there are some expensive alternatives that are out there, right? But there are companies like BoardSpan or smaller recruiting firms that will do it for a reasonable fee. And the data is important because if the director contests what that individual, the chair of the board or chair non-gov is saying, you can always start the conversation with, here's what you're doing well that your directors recognize, and here's what your directors say you need to do more of. And if you can't do that, then it's time for you to think about leaving. And you could either resign on your own, or we could just not nominate you for the next go round. If it's a public company, or even if it's a private company, sometimes they have turnover over a couple of number of years. So you just say, we're not going to let you stand for re-election, or you can voluntarily resign. So most who want to keep their reputation intact will voluntarily resign.
So Evelyn, in the world of employees, we often see folks getting put on a performance improvement plan. Is that the case at a board level where they're given a heads up they're underperforming and then a time to remedy it? How does that timeline work?
I think it works probably what you just mentioned. It's similar to an employee program. It depends on what happens, right? So if a person has never been given the feedback and you're given the feedback the first time, you want to see that they've changed. And sometimes you can just say, look, we'd love for you to contribute more. We know your background says that you can contribute at the strategic level. We'd like to see that. And if they don't turn it around, then you can have that discussion with them again. So for example, a lot of times we bring on people who are technology focused, but they only contribute at the technology functional level. They don't contribute to the larger strategy of the organization. So the coaching technique would be, you've sat in as an executive vice president of your organization. We know you contributed at a strategic level, not just at your technical functional level. So we'd like you to see you do that. And if after, a year they don't, then it's time to have that conversation saying, you're not living up to what we expected of you. So therefore it's time for you to leave.
You've really offered some useful vocabulary for our listeners, I think. We're going to have some of those conversations. And our discussion for the past few minutes has been really about the NAMGov chair or the chair, who's ever having the conversation on the delivering side. Let's turn the table and say, if you are yourself a director who's being offboarded, either because term limits are up or because it's an involuntary behavioral related departure, what's the best practice about how they should handle that? And likewise, the other 10 or 12 or 20 people around the table, how do they handle those two different kinds of departures?
Well, if you're a public company, you have to be careful because anytime a board director is offboarded, voluntarily or involuntarily, it's a Section 8, an S8 disclosure that you have to have out in the public. So general counsels will normally say, if you're going to term out or voluntarily leave, let's plan this in a way that it doesn't hurt the company. We did have one involuntary departure because of poor behavior in the organization towards other board members. And we had to file an S8 when that individual left. The other board members did not know, was specific towards one or two other board members. So it wasn't shared widely about why that director left. And then there's others where it's term limits, right? I have a term limit coming up and it's natural, so I just won't stand for re-election. And that's part of the normal cadence of the organization. And in that particular case, usually there's an exit interview with that director. But again, if it's a term in normal succession planning, and this is something that the board does, it's just natural for a board to continue without having an exit interview because everybody was on good terms and they understand this is the protocol.
You probably have a nice board dinner and send them off with lots of hugs and applause.
Oh, yes. Send them off with, a nice gold watch.
Yeah. Does that still happen, Evelyn? Is anyone getting the gold watch?
I think they might be shares in the company or something.
Lovely. Okay. So you said a little while ago that the discussion, if it's a little contentious, the departure, is focused from the organization's perspective. How can we minimize or mitigate risk to the company of looking anything but great? So can you speak for a minute about what kind of risks would come up when the company's handling a departure of a director?
Those kind of risks are, did the director leave because they disagree with the strategy? So is there something wrong with the strategy that an investor may pick up on? And, in today's days of AI and deep fake, it's easy enough for the bots to pick up a wording in a SEC disclosure and then blow that wording up to be something that might be damaging to the company. You probably know these days that when you do an investor call for reporting your earnings, it's the bots that listen into your call. They do automatic trading based on the words that you use in your earnings release. So I can imagine that if you are not careful about your disclosure about why a director is leaving, and normally those disclosures saying there are no contentious issues, a bot could pick that up and assume something is wrong with the organization and your stock price could go down when you don't expect it to.
Getting heart palpitations just thinking about that. So we've been talking about this a little generically, like a director, the director. Sometimes we have a little special case. So if the director being offboarded is a founder of the company or a former CEO that turned director, how do those conversations need to be handled? How are they different from a typical conversation?
Those are very difficult conversations to have, Susan. And again, that's where the word courage comes up because somebody has to have the courage to have that conversation. And it's not a one and done kind of conversation. So if it's a founder of an organization, unless the founder has self-awareness to know that they can't run the organization forever and are willing to step down on their own and hire in the talent. So for example, I'm on the board of Tempur-Pedic. Bobby Trussell was the founder, but he recognized he was not the person to lead the company forward. And he ran it for a while, but then he brought in professional management to help take the company to the next level. Same for Health Equity. Steve Millman was the founder. He's a trauma surgeon by background, and he's heavily involved with the company today, but he also knows he needs somebody who understands how do you run a professional organization that's, $1 billion, $2 billion, or in the case of Tempur-Pedic, $7 billion in revenue. Normally, founders aren't the people to do that. Those that are self-aware make it easier. For those that are not, it's a very heavy conversation, and it's usually somebody who's friends with that director or that CEO because a lot of those CEOs will bring in friends into the organization. So it has to be somebody who's really close to that individual. If it's not the founder, if you've got a normal board succession plan, then you can have that discussion. I've been doing that with one of my boards. We're talking about board succession. I said, this is for everybody. It's not just the individuals in the boardroom, but it's also the chair of the board.
In those special cases, or really in any case where it might be appropriate, when would we make somebody an emeritus board member? And is that really just honorary, or is that?
I would never do that. I would never do that. Only because what's that role of the individual? You have to define it. Do they just come to the parties at the end of the year or the board retreats? They don't have a vote. And in many cases, depending on the individual, they can feel like they have an oversized voice in the boardroom when they no longer have a vote. So my vote would to not have an emeritus director, or even if a CEO, I would not have them stay on the board for any length of time. Because as you know, anybody who's left their role and stayed in the organization with their successor, it's hard, as you know. Your successor wants to change things and you think, gee, I put that in place. It was great. Why are you changing it? So I just don't think it's good practice.
Heard. Yeah. So if you were designing an offboarding provision for a board just from scratch, what's the one clause you would insist on including?
The one clause is you have to have an offboarding and succession plan. I mentioned earlier, I believe in term limits. So for an offboarding clause, I would make sure that we have term limits and that when a board director comes on, a brand new director, we talk to them about term limits. And we will say, in fact, on one of my boards, what we decided is we have guidelines, 10 to 12 years. A chair of the board we think should serve at least 10 years, but no more than that. And a chair of a committee should serve 3 to 5 years, because then you want succession planning to rotate, allow them to rotate into other leading roles in the organization. But that we'll have a conversation with them at the end of 3 years to say, do you still like the role you're in? What do you think is your next role? Again, based on skill set and capabilities and interest. You're chairing audit now. A lot of the natural skill set may move to compensation because of the numbers aspect. But do you have the human talent skills, which a lot of the compensation committees now have, right? Or move over to Nom and Gov. As long as you understand that you're going to have that conversation at the end of 3 years, we may not move you until 5 years, but you're going to rotate. Say that up front, say it in the very beginning, and it just makes life so much easier.
Spoken from experience, we can tell. Evelyn, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you, Susan.
And I'll just remind our listeners that we have another conversation we've recorded with Evelyn about board succession planning, and that looks at refreshing the boardroom in our previous episode.
That concludes this episode of BoardVision. We hope you enjoyed listening. Please subscribe and join us next time. Until then, visit nacdonline.org to stay informed about the latest resources NACD has to offer, such as memberships, certification, national or chapter events, and our content, including reports, articles, and Directorship Magazine. That's nacdonline.org. Thank you for listening.